In the original Purchase Order Generator video, we learned how to create a set of forms in VBA, develop some macros to work with the fields of the forms and cells in our worksheet, and ultimately generate a complete purchase order based on the inputs to the forms. In this video, we're going to build off of this by adding some new features to the tool that make it a bit more robust and functional. Specifically in this video, we'll learn to add rows to our purchase order so that we may add any number of items to our purchase orders, and remove items from our purchase order. To start, we need to first find the code that limits our purchase order to 5 items. This is contained in the Add Item Click subroutine of our product selection form. Hit Alt F11 to bring up the VBA project screen, right-click on the product selection form, and select View Code. We'll comment out these lines of code by typing an apostrophe in front of each line. Now that our code won't quit when we reach 5 items, we need to update some cells and add code to keep track of how many items we have in our purchase order. First, let's go back to our purchase order worksheet and select cell A1. This cell previously contained a function to count how many items had been added up to 5. We need to remove this function, and instead we'll just enter a hard-coded number of 1 in the cell to start with, and then we'll update the numbers sequentially through our code. This number will indicate which number the new item is in the order. So we have 1 to start, meaning when we add an item to the purchase order, it will be item 1. The cell will then be updated to read 2, though we will still only have 1 item in our purchase order. Next, we'll go back to our VBA project view, and just above where we commented out the previous code, we'll add code to update the value of that range. We'll select range next item dot value is equal to next item plus 1. This way, every time this code runs, it will increment our count by 1. Now we'll add code that inserts a row before we add each new entry. We'll go up to the top of the Add Item Click subroutine just below our variable declaration. We'll start with an if statement to determine if we need to insert a row at all. Our base PO template will start with 1 row, so the first item doesn't need a new row inserted, but all items after the first item will need a new row. So our if statement will read, if next item is greater than 1, then we'll insert the item and we'll end our if statement. Within the if statement, we'll add a line of code to insert a row. We'll select our range, we'll select the entire row, and then we'll select insert. The code will select the cell in column B just below our last item in the purchase order. We'll then select the entire row of that cell and insert a new row above it, effectively adding a new row to the end of the purchase order to make room for our new item. Now, unfortunately, the inserted row did not copy the formatting of our purchase order item down. We're missing some of the border and font styles. So we'll add some additional code to copy the formatting of the previous line down to the new line we just inserted. We'll start by writing a line of code to select the row just above the line we just inserted, which is why we need to subtract 1 from our range argument. Next, we'll add a resize function to make our selection from B to N. Resize works by taking the 2 arguments, the number of rows to resize is the first argument, and the number of columns to resize is the second argument, separated by a comma. In this case, we'll just want to resize 12 columns to our right, so we'll put a blank, comma, 12. Finally, we'll copy the selection. Now let's do the same for our new row, but instead of copying the selection, we'll paste special, passing through the Excel paste formats variant. This will only paste the formatting as opposed to pasting values and functions, leaving our new line blank until we add a new item to our PO. Finally, we need to make sure our line item subtotals are calculating and our overall PO subtotal is calculating. Unfortunately, neither is updating when we add a new row. What we'll do is calculate these at the end of the PO when the user clicks the Finish Order button. So within our product selection code, we'll scroll down to the Finish Order Click subroutine. We need to start by adding variable declarations for PO row start, next item, and subtotal. PO row start will be the beginning row of our PO in the worksheet. Next item will be the count or the ID of the next item we would add to the purchase order, and subtotal is the subtotal of the PO. Subtotal must be of type single so that we can capture decimal places. Integers cannot hold decimals and round to whole numbers. The next item in PO row start variables can be assigned values to start as we had previously done. Next, we'll add a conditional to determine if we even need to go through this exercise. If we only have one item in our purchase order, then we don't need to copy anything down because the formula has done all the work. In this case, however, we need to check if next item is greater than 2. If we have only one item in our PO, next item would be incremented from 1 to 2, even though we only have one item in the purchase order. So we'll say if next item is greater than 2, then, which will define our if statement. Within our if statement, we'll select and copy the subtotal from the first item in our PO. This cell contains the formula to calculate the subtotal for the line, but this was not copied down for each new row that we added. Then we'll move to the second item in our purchase order, perform a resize again, but this time we want to move down rows. We'll move down next item minus 2 rows. We're doing this because next item is always one greater than the number of PO items we have, and we've skipped the first row, or the first item in the purchase order. So those are 2 items we need to subtract from our next item count. We will call the pastespecial function again, this time passing the XL paste formulas and number formats variants. Below our if statement, we'll now create a for loop to determine our subtotal, and we'll loop through the for loop from 1 to next item minus 1 number of times. Again, because next item is one greater than the number of items we have in the purchase order, we need to loop through one less time than the amount stored in the variable. Within our loop, we'll be adding the subtotal of each item in our PO to the subtotal variable we previously defined. So each occurrence needs to add subtotal to the value of the next line and assign the sum back to the subtotal. Finally, outside of our loop, we'll populate the PO subtotal cell within the value in our subtotal variable. Now let's test functionality to ensure it all works appropriately. So within our purchase order, we'll create a new form here and just give it a random name. We'll add some items to our purchase order, and you'll notice you won't see anything going on in the background because we've turned off application screen updating. If you commented out those lines of code, you could actually see items being added to the purchase order here. And we'll make sure we add more than 5 just to confirm we can add as many as we want. Should be 6, and then we'll finish our order. As you can see here, we've got our count of 6 items, all with our quantities and the information that we previously got. You can see here all of our formatting as we wanted to be able to add into it has been copied down, as well as the line item subtotals, and they seem to be calculating correctly here. And then finally you can see our subtotal has been listed here, and let's just confirm it's calculating correctly. And as you can see, it has. So everything seems to be working well now. If you want to reset this, just make sure you delete these lines, clear out any information, and then reset this next item number back to 1 to create a new purchase order. For the second part of this project, we're going to add a Remove Item from PO button to our product selection form. This will bring up a new form we'll create that displays all items currently in our PO and allows us to remove one we select. To begin, let's create a new user form, copying the elements of the product selection form since we'll want to present a lot of the same information. Within the new Remove Selection form, we need to revise a few elements and add a few more elements. First, we need to change the source of data for the list box. We'll create a new named range called PO list, which will be the list of items from our purchase order. We'll extend it from cells D11 to D12, which will cause the range to automatically expand and contract based on the items we add and remove to the purchase order. We'll then assign the source of data for our list box to the name range PO list. Next, we need to add a label to the text box to display our quantity and a label to the text box to display our line item total. These will be populated when we select an item from the purchase order to remove. Now we need to create some code to run when we select an item from the list box. We want to pull data about the item, basically. We'll start by copying the product list click subroutine from our product selection form. Within our copied code, we need to add some variables, specifically our next item and PO row start variables we've used before. We'll assign values to them as we have before as well. The code we copied will work fine as it did previously, but we need to add some code to the end of our subroutine to get our quantity and line item total. We'll start with the quantity. First, we must identify the item we have selected based on its product ID. Using a for loop, we'll loop through all items in our PO until we match the product ID we selected. When we identify the correct product ID, we'll move one cell to the left to pull our PO quantity. We'll do this using the .offset function, which is similar to the resize function, taking in a value for the number of rows to offset and the number of columns to offset, separated by a comma. Since we want to move one column to the left, the row will be blank, and we'll just put a -1 for the columns. Negatives will move us left or up, positive numbers will move us right or down. The value of that cell will be placed to the value of our PO quantity text box we created previously. Since we've identified the product we're looking for and the quantity of that product, we can exit our for loop. To figure out our quantity, we'll multiply the value of the PO quantity text box by the unit price variable we previously recorded through the code we copied. We'll assign this to our PO line total text box. Now we must create the code to remove an item from our PO when we click the Remove Item button we've added to our form. We'll begin by creating our variables we'll be using. As with other subroutines, we'll need to start with an item count and PO row start variables so we have a starting and ending point for our PO, and we'll assign values to those. The product ID and length variables are needed so we know which item to remove. Since our product ID we have selected is stored as a caption, we need to parse the caption to get the product ID. As you'll recall, the caption contains the text product ID, and followed by a space. This is then followed by the actual product ID, which is all we really want. We'll start by getting the length of the PO product ID caption. Next, using the write function, we'll parse out the actual product ID we want to remove. Write works by taking the set of characters on the right side of the string based on the number of characters we define. For example, write hello world, 5 will return world. In our situation, we don't know how many characters the product ID is, but since we know the length of the entire caption and the length of the text we don't want, being the product ID, followed by a space, we can mathematically determine the number of characters to take from the write. This is going to be length minus 12, with 12 being the number of characters in that product ID, space text. The result is however many characters are the actual product ID, stored in our product ID variable. And now we want to find the product ID selected and remove it from the purchase order. We'll use another for loop to accomplish this. We'll run the loop through the count of items in our purchase order. If the product ID variable matches the value in column C, then we found the right item. Can select that particular item's row using the EntireRow function and delete it. We'll want to update our range capturing the number of items in our PO similar to what we did when we added items to the PO, only this time subtracting 1. And we can exit our for loop using the exit for command because we don't need to loop through any items further. Finally, we need to go back to the button we added to the product selection form that brings up the Remove Item form. We need to add some code to this button so that the form actually displays. The code behind the button will first check to see if we've added any items to our purchase order, and if we have, we'll hide our product selection form and show the Remove Item form. If not, we'll use the message box function to display a message saying we don't have any items in our purchase order and therefore there is nothing to remove. We'll also pass the VB critical variant to this function so that it is highlighted as an error. There are other variants like VB information that are indicators as to the type of message box being displayed. It's mostly visual, though some do affect the workings of the actual message box itself. Now let's test the functionality to ensure it all works appropriately. We'll start by creating a new purchase order form. And first we'll start by adding some items to our purchase order. And I'm going to list the quantity as the item order or the item number. That way we can tell when an item was removed and that it was the right item that we removed here. And then let's click on the Remove Selection button. As you can see here in our list, we have just the items in our purchase order. There's not all the items that are available for us. And if we select each of these, you can see our general information is brought up as well as our quantities and subtotals. And the subtotal appears to be calculating correctly. And then let's select an item to remove. So let's remove the ice cube trays. And then let's remove another item. And as you can see, the ice cube trays are gone from our list because they're not in the purchase order anymore. And then it's just our 4 remaining items. And let's remove one more here. Finish the order. Great, so our items 2 and 3 were removed, and all that we have remaining is 1 can opener, 4 trash cans, and 5 vacuums. And all the functionality we worked on in section 1 is still working here. Our subtotals calculating correctly, as well as our subtotal for the entire purchase order, and we're ready to send it off. That's it for today's lesson from Excel Exposure. The working version of the tool is available to download as a reference source, and please check out the homework we've created, which has a few tasks to even further enhance the capabilities of what we've worked on today. Please stay tuned for our next session where we'll be talking through how to enhance the visual stylings of our product selection form and account for sales.